5:31. Folks, my name is Amit Nankuliar. Glad to have you all here on this research and publications seminar. We have Professor Martin Parker joining from School of Management at University of Bristol in the UK. He writes about alternative organizations and economies. The last three books are about Anarchism, Organizational Management, and then Life After COVID. And 2018 was his book, Shut Down the Business School. So I guess you and Martin is a very well cited scholar, and we are just talking about a lot of things. So today he's going to talk about, he's interested in what academics and universities can do to address the frightening future that awaits us. So Martin, over to you. Thank you so much for taking time out, and welcome to Research and Publication Seminar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amit, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be there virtually. I wish I could be there in person. What I'll do is I'll talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, just summarizing some of my ideas, and then leave the remaining 20 minutes or so for questions, because I'd be really interested in understanding what your responses to my arguments might be. It's worth saying kind of two sort of prefatory things really before I start. One is to say that, my context is very much Northwest European. And so lots of my kind of understandings and references and so on are really related to my background in critical management studies. So I was originally trained in sociology and anthropology, and ended up working in schools of business and management about 20 years ago. But partly because of that training, I think I've remained very critical of what business and management education commonly is, in terms of the way it manifests itself in North America and Northwest Europe. As a result, I'm kind of known, I suppose, to be an internal critic of the business school, to be, the sort of hypocrite who takes the salary but complains anyway, something along those lines. And so much of what I say might sound to be quite confrontational, and it is intended to be. That's the point. The second thing to say is that I guess a lot of my thinking at the moment, like most of us, I suppose, is very much shaped by the twin crises of climate change and COVID. And the sense in which they both, in slightly different ways, demonstrate to us just how much we need to change in terms of our human systems on this planet. I have for many years, I've had a strong sense that business schools can play a positive role in these kinds of changes, but also a strong disappointment that most of the time business schools seem to carry on teaching us that we can carry on with business as usual. And I think that's part of the problem. Part of the problem, not the only part, but part of the problem is the idea that we can carry on doing the forms of capitalism, global capitalism, that we currently reproduce. So those are the kind of two introductory remarks, and they probably give you some idea about the kind of things that I'll be talking about. Let me just share my screen with the PowerPoint I'll be using. So what I'm going to do is really spin through the arguments in a book from a couple of years ago called Shut Down the Business School, which was a kind of an attempt to pull together a series of my complaints about the way that business management education and research was structured. And many of these arguments are ones that have been kind of they're informed by my background in sociology and anthropology, but also very much shaped by the kind of contemporary crises that I think we face. So I've got three different titles there. There's the one that I was given, Making Management Education More Relevant to Organisational Societal Challenges. The positive version of this is Towards a School for Organisation, or the negative version, to Shut Down the Business School. So business schools then. The business school is the object in the North, around the Atlantic countries, of an enormous amount of popular skepticism. And I think it's worth remembering that, really, that for lots of popular culture, the business school and MBAs and business school professors are objects of a certain sort of derision. They're regarded to be rather stupid people who teach a fake discipline and teach students how to be greedy, how to be evil, how to exploit more, and so on. For quite a few years, I've been sort of collecting examples from popular culture of the way in which business schools are represented. I don't know how it works in India, but there's a clear sense in say Western popular culture that if you want to pick a bad guy, if you want to have a bad character of some kind, then make them a business school. Make them attend a business school, because that's the best way of presenting them as greedy and vacuous and empty and so on. Now, I think that kind of popular cultural reflection on business schools is worth us remembering, because when we sit within the shiny halls of business schools with all their kind of publicity and enthusiasm and all the rest of it, it's easy enough for us to forget what the outside world thinks business schools are and what they do. There's a nice little cartoon here in which, of course, the business school is basically a way of teaching bosses how to take the credit and deflect the blame, for example. There are endless cartoons like this if you want to hoover your way across Google Images. Now, the history of business schools is a complicated one, but in terms of its history in Northwest Europe, effectively what we can say is the first business schools kind of grow with the maturing of the Industrial Revolution, effectively, and the importance of producing some kind of education which was aimed at a growing managerial class. So the first business schools aren't in the States, as is a story which is sometimes told. They're in Northwest Europe, so in places like Budapest and Paris and Anvers and so on. And usually there were places that were teaching forms of finance and accounting, often growing out of schools that were teaching kind of double entry bookkeeping and things like that. But quite often, particularly in continental Europe, the business schools were then backed by the local chambers of commerce. So this sort of idea that a growing cadre of business leaders, of bourgeois, if you like, the bourgeois classes, were becoming interested in how they reproduce themselves, how they produce effective managers for the future. So these are the kind of the earliest schools, and it's kind of interesting in that sense that the story that we very often inherit is that, as I suggested, the business school begins in the States. It doesn't. The US business school is almost a century later than many of the Northwest European business schools. So places like Harvard and Wharton and Penn and so on, these were really established from the late 19th century onwards, partly inheriting this idea of a certain kind of training for a new cadre of managers for large organizations and so on, but combining with that a certain sort of moral project, the idea that the leaders of these organizations needed to be given a certain a sort of moral strength in order that they didn't take advantage of their position. And in part, this was a diagnosis of the extremes of American capitalism by the time we move into the late 19th, early 20th century. So a system in which you had astonishing concentrations of wealth and power, very often in key industries like oil and wheat and so on. These huge organizations dominated by particular individuals who were wealthy beyond the dreams of human beings, and then large numbers of people who were either just working for them or just starving. So the kind of the inequalities, in a sense, of capitalism at that time propel a certain kind of morality into the business schools of that era, suggesting that people need to be taught not only accounting, but also something about the purposes and values of business. Now, spinning forward a century and a bit, we have an enormous number of business schools globally. There is no effective way of measuring this kind of stuff because there are no single institutions that represent all business schools. But 2011, AACSB estimates about 13,000 business schools. India is estimated to have about 3,000 private schools of business. And the amount of cash moving through these institutions is enormous. London Business School, and I checked this one yesterday, is now advertising a tuition fee of nearly £93,000. That's an extraordinary sum of money for a qualification. And doing the maths on this for the book a couple of years ago, even taking relatively conservative assumptions, then the fee income alone of business schools globally must be in the region of $400 billion. It's a massive global industry. Now, that's kind of important for us to remember, that we're sort of part of this much bigger global production line for people with qualifications in business and management. But I think it's worth kind of stepping back from that and asking, well, what do these schools actually do? What do business schools represent? This is London Business School, which is obviously, you know, it's sort of, I suppose, be regarded as the key business school in the UK, not the only one by any means. There's about 100 business schools in the UK. But London Business School is very often regarded to be one of the kind of the global elite. And it certainly presents itself in that way. You know, if you look at the strapline for London Business School, effectively what you've got is a kind of a fairly generic description of the personal benefits that you will gain from a qualification in business at London. So it's selling this particular idea about what you as an individual can get if you invest whatever it'll be, £93,000 in your career in this way. So far so good, but this is where I think it gets a bit difficult, because if we look at the curriculum of most business schools across the world most of the time, what we actually find is a remarkable degree of homogeneity. Yeah, most business schools appear to teach the same kind of stuff, and they teach it in the same kind of ways. Sometimes this is explained in terms of the inheritance of the big American business schools from the late 19th century. But effectively, what I'm going to suggest, and this is simplifying massively, is that business schools teach three core principles, and that they illustrate that in a whole series of their disciplines. But this is essentially the kind of the heart of what they do. First of all, I think that the business school concentrates on one form of organization, the corporation. The corporation tends to be, if you like, the kind of regarded to be the ultimate form of organization for business schools, in that other organizational forms are almost regarded to be the precursors of the corporation. The corporation is a bit like the most developed form of organization, and anything else, partnerships or co-ops or family business or whatever, is regarded to be a kind of an immature form of organizing, which really aspires to become the corporation. And that means that the poster kids for business schools globally tend to be the big corporations. They're the ones that attract the most interest, the most research, the ones that are used in case studies and so on. These are regarded to be the forms of organization to admire and to aspire to. And that also means that the question of shareholder value becomes the key way of thinking about value within the business school. Other questions of how we might think about social value or environmental value or personal value, all of the other ways in which the word value is used in the English language, are really secondary to the idea of shareholder value as being the key purpose of managers within the corporation. Secondly, I think that business schools teach growth. They teach us to assume that growth at pretty much every level you can imagine is a good thing and should be encouraged. So whether we're talking about national economies or the growth of corporations, the growth of number of employees or products or territories or whatever it might be, the assumption is that the trajectory of growth is one that's to be encouraged. And if a company is not growing, then it is somehow problematic. It's not working properly in one way or another. And obviously, this is connected to those questions about shareholder value, because growth very often propels value, but it effectively means that there's a kind of a sort of background assumption in a great deal of business school teaching that big is necessarily beautiful. That, you know, the larger an organization is, the more successful it is, the more effective it'll be, the more admirable it is, and so on. And then thirdly, I think, and I've written about this in other contexts, that business schools tend to teach us something about the inevitability of management. That's to say that within organizations, some form of hierarchy is inevitable, and that a particular cadre of individuals, the managers, will always have specialist forms of knowledge which the ordinary workers don't have. So it effectively embeds the idea that hierarchical forms of organization led by specialists is necessary, is inevitable, is good in a whole variety of different ways. And of course, you'd expect that from an institution which is effectively teaching managers. Okay, of course, you're going to tell managers that they're really important, because otherwise they might not pay you that much money. So those three assumptions, and I'm treating these as very broad guiding assumptions, seem to me to shape the vast majority of business school teaching right the way across the planet. They seem to be embedded in it. So what's this for? You know, who benefits from this? And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. It's effectively to say that those who benefit from business school education, who invest in it, who spend £93,000 with London Business School and so on, are those who want to benefit from, or already do benefit from, the standard model of global capitalism. So effectively, we could shortcut some of this stuff by saying that business schools teach global capitalism. That's their function, that's their role. We can disguise that in a whole series of different ways, but essentially that's what they do. And I think that's a problem. So why is it a problem? Well, for a variety of reasons, and let me very quickly run through these. So first of all, capitalism is generating gigantic inequalities, both within nations and between nations. There are so many ways in which you can demonstrate this, but let's just point to the personal wealth of Jeff Bezos and use that as the example. The distinctions between the extraordinarily wealthy and the staggeringly poor are clear globally. And that's a process which is being exacerbated by current forms of capitalism. Capitalism also generates a set of hegemonic relations between big corporations. This is a corporate map of companies, primarily in the food sector, and the way in which a series of holding companies and concentrations and buyouts and all the rest of it now are effectively producing a smaller and smaller number of larger and larger organizations that dominate the global landscape, that are increasingly difficult to escape from in a variety of ways. Social media being the topical and obvious example. Capitalism is also generating externalities, most notably, of course, a whole series of ways in which capitalism is polluting our planet, is producing gigantic quantities of plastic, is poisoning rivers, is making our air unclean, and so on. And in addition, capitalism is producing climate change. The dominance of capitalism across the planet, whether it's capitalism with a Chinese face or an American face, effectively means that the rush to carbon generation and usage is greater now than it ever has been, despite all the scientific warnings. So it seems to me that we live at a time when we have an economic system which is being reproduced by business schools, which is presenting an existential challenge to our future as a species. So business schools, it seems to me, are really kind of correctly imagined as places that are reproducing a particular kind of ideology. a set of ideas about the dominance of certain ways of thinking about organization, exchange, growth, and so on, that is dangerous to us as a species. And this is something which I think needs to change immediately. And it's not enough to talk about various forms of reform. What we need to do is to radically rethink what we imagine business schools to be and the kind of organizations and forms of organizing that they teach us about. So what can we do about it? And the we here, talking to, I suppose, is a collection of people who already work within or study within business schools. Now, as many of you know, within the context of business school education, the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen an increasing interest in questions of corporate social responsibility, the diversity of any particular organization, sustainability, business ethics, and so on. Most of the time, even though many high quality schools, including I'm sure mine and yours, offer modules on these kinds of things, so you can probably do a business ethics module at your place just as you can at mine. These are usually regarded to be add-ons to the existing curriculum. The core parts of the curriculum remain strategy, finance, accounting, and so on. They're the kind of the beating heart of what people are going to learn if they come to business school. Very often the other stuff is the kind of the extra bits, the bits that are used by the business school to demonstrate just how much they care, but are not necessarily core to the curriculum itself. Now, over the last 30 years or so, in Northwest Europe in particular, particularly the UK and Scandinavia, you've seen the growth of this movement called critical management studies. And that's something I've been fairly closely associated with over the last couple of decades. Critical management studies has effectively tried to reinvent, or rather, no, that's not quite the right word. It's tried to develop criticisms of established forms of business school education and research, primarily by importing a set of ideas from other parts of the social sciences, whether they be about feminism or anarchism or Marxism or green stuff or socialist stuff, whatever it might be. It's been a way of kind of bringing those criticisms in to the business school and trying to aim them at the school themselves. The problem with critical management studies is that 30 years later, it's made no damn difference. An awful lot of people have written an awful lot of books, and many places in the UK and elsewhere regard themselves to be key schools for teaching and research on critical management studies. But in terms of the overall trajectory of business schools, it doesn't seem to have made much difference. So somebody like me, relatively easy to publish a lot about various elements of critical management studies, but it's almost as if this is a little game played by certain sorts of people like me that doesn't make a difference to what deans or students do and think. A war of the pen. The other part of the we, of course, is that we, academics, students, are also members of societies that have politics in them too, and many of us might be involved in political parties or social movements or shaping our purchasing in various sorts of ways, and maybe even standing for political office and so on. That's another element of the we. And so some of our concerns about inequality, about social justice, about climate change and so on may well be expressed through other forms of action that we take place, but that aren't integral to our life as business school academics or students. Now, the key thing, and this is the hinge in the argument, I think, is to say that all this notwithstanding, I think that the possibility of using the business school as a real lever for change is still there, because business schools are so big and so important to particularly in the UK, to the economics of the university system itself, that they provide us with a kind of platform for doing a variety of things that might accelerate what I would see to be desirable changes. And I think that the most important thing here is effectively to displace ideas about management and replace them with notions about organizing. I'll explain this a little more as I go along, but essentially what I want to argue is that management as the discipline that is taught within the business school needs to be seen as one element in a broader way of thinking about organizing. Organizing is a bigger concept than management. Organizing is a way of describing how people and things come together, and organizing varies historically, spatially, nationally, ethnically. Organizing is a various concept. My previous training in sociology and anthropology demonstrated very effectively to me that people organize themselves in different ways in different times. Okay, so that, you know, assumptions about economics, about kinship, about leisure, about work, about birth and death and marriage, and all of those things differ vastly across the globe. So the human being, as species, the human being has solved these problems in a wide variety of different ways. There is not one way in which human beings organize themselves. And that seems to be really important in terms of thinking about the possibilities of organization versus the narrow assumptions that are built into ideas about management as one specific form of organizing. So organizing here, I'm defining as a kind of an object of inquiry, which is the proper object of that part of the university which is concerned with exchange relationships, with value, with organizations. Organizing should be our umbrella concept. Management is one way in which we can do organizing, but it's not the only one. Now here I kind of use in the book, I use a couple of examples in terms of thinking about what's missing from the current business school curriculum. And that's really where I'm getting to in the talk now. Back in the 1960s, in Anglo sociology, you had the development of this idea for thinking about schools in terms of the hidden curriculum. That's to say what wasn't taught. And particularly for scholars who were interested in questions of race and ethnicity and gender and so on, they were just as interested in what was missing rather than what was there. So, you know, if you were teaching young girls, for example, about science, the fact that all the scientists that were presented were male was seen to be a problem because the message that was being provided was effectively that women can't do science, okay? Or if you had, you know, some ethnic minority kids in a classroom and none of the significant cultural figures which were being presented, all of the significant cultural figures were white, then of course that was sending the message that nobody with brown skin could do anything that was worthwhile and important on the global stage. So the hidden curriculum is a way of effectively talking about what the power of what doesn't get said, okay? So what's the hidden curriculum of the business school? Now, it seems to me that the hidden curriculum of the business school is all those ways in which we can organize, exchange, and produce collective value that are not part of the corporate managerial pro-growth mindset. And there are lots of these. This is a small selection of actually existing ways of thinking about more cooperative, more mutual, more environmentally sensitive ways of thinking about business and organization. These do not get taught in the vast majority of business schools. And even if they do, they get taught in small modules off to the side about alternative organization or about co-op. The core business is still about the dominance of the big pro-growth, heavily managed organization, okay, corporation. Now, it seems to me that this is an odd thing, okay, at the very least, because effectively it means that what's being taught in the business school relies on a huge number of exclusions. You know, the business school effectively denies the existence of a whole series of other forms of organization. And this is a profoundly worrying situation, partly because, of course, it's very difficult for a business school or a university with a business school to then present this as if it were some kind of impartial knowledge. What would we think about a history department that only taught about the 15th and 19th centuries? Or a geography department that didn't teach about some parts of the world? Or a medical school that ignored certain parts of the human body? That would be positively bizarre. But effectively what we have is business schools that teach that capitalism is the only way to organize, that managers are necessary in every organization, that all organizations need to grow. Yeah, they teach a version of pro-growth global capitalism as if it were the only option, and that's simply not the case. A metaphor I quite like to use here is in terms of thinking about diversity in other fields. This is a short introduction from the Royal Horticultural Society Encyclopedia of Plants and Flowers. And there are zillions of different plants and flowers. Nature solves the problems of how to grow plants and flowers in lots of different ways, in lots of different habitats. So you get gigantic trees and tiny flowers and mosses and algae and things that flower at different times of year and things that like salt and things that like alkaline soils and all the rest of it. You wouldn't assume that there was one right way in which you were a plant, yeah, because diversity is the key. And yet we seem to do the opposite in the business school. We seem to assume that what we're trying to search for is the best way. This is Frederick Taylor's phrase, right? The best way in which we can do organizing, rather than appreciating the sheer variety, the diversity of ways in which human beings solve their problems. Quite a few years ago, I, with some colleagues, decided to do a big book, a dictionary of alternatives, in which what we were going to do was it was effectively a kind of a sort of art project in a way. And what we wanted to do was to have a whole series of words talking about co-ops and communes and mutuals and all sorts of different ways of thinking about organizing and different utopias and thinking about how the mafia organize and how terrorist groups organize, or whatever it might be, all these different ways in which organization was possible. And one of the entries, and it's in here somewhere, that's too small, one of the entries was going to be management as a specific form of organization, one amongst many, but not the only one, and certainly not one that should be taught as to the taught in a way that obscured the possibility of human creativity generating all these other ways of solving our problems. So, and this is the end of my talk, what I propose is, instead of the business school, a school for organizing. A school that teaches us about how we generate a low carbon economy, how we localize our supply chains, how we try to achieve collective and democratic control over our forms of organization, an economy in which small is not necessarily seen to be a problem, and responsibility to people and planet is built in to organizing. That's what the School for Organizing could be doing. That's what could replace the business school. The School for Organizing, for me, is a way of thinking about how we show political possibility within business school teaching and research, rather than concealing capitalist inevitability as if it were the only way in which we could go. So I think that's both a way of potentially contributing towards dealing with the species threatening crisis that faces us, but also a way of paying out our responsibility as educators and researchers to be fully covering the subject that we claim to be representing. And that's why we should shut down the business school. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for listening. I'll stop sharing and opening it up for questions. I guess Amit will share this.
Right. Thanks, Martin, for that wonderful presentation. It's not enough that we critique ourselves and open ourselves to navel gazing.
I'm sorry, Nept is not to get the PowerPoints to work, though. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. At this point of time, I'll really open up to the audience. Please, they're free to ask questions. They can use the chat box or whichever way, we'd like to keep it going. I have a hand going up.
Yeah, Professor Martin, wonderful talk. So really enjoyed it. So my question is related to understanding your views on the policy school, for example, the Harvard Kennedy School and things like that. So one, how does the policy school fit in with your ideas of a school for organization? And the second part of my question is, with the current challenges that we have with respect to climate change, rising inequality, claims for diversity inclusion. These are some of the things that are actually covered in modules for policy schools. They preach a lot on things like sustainable development in their core principles. So do you think that the policy school is a good way going forward? And a lot of the stakeholders for policy schools are mostly think tanks and organizations such as UN, the WHO, local governments, national governments also. Do you think these organizations are able to leverage the best out of a policy school as compared to what the corporate world or the corporate hierarchy does out of a business school? Is that leverage, is that inefficient leverage a possible reason for their inefficiency?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question, and I do kind of recognise the distinction you're using there. So, policy schools, whether talking about public or social policy, I mean, they differ a bit depending on which country you're talking about, but are essentially have as their constituency state and sub-state policy makers and actors, in a way that the constituency of the business school is the corporation. Now, I think, I'm pretty positive about states in general. I think they can do some quite helpful things, and clearly in terms of dealing with many of the kind of the macro structural issues that face us, say, for example, carbon pricing, or taxing aviation fuel, or whatever it might be, we're going to need states to be effective in those domains.
Yeah.
Problem for me in some sense is the separation between the idea of the policy school representing the state and the business school representing the business community, because in a sense you've got then a sort of division between the idea of benevolent bureaucrats who have our best interests at heart, and kind of lunatic capitalists who just want to sell us anything, yeah, and will decorate it with corporate social responsibility if it helps them sell more stuff. And that's a really dangerous distinction, I think. What I'd like to see is in a way pulling the business schools towards the sense of responsibility and stewardship that the policy schools very often exemplify, at the same time as policy schools need to recognize that the state will need to intervene in the constitution of business itself, in the ways in which business is allowed to operate. And the clearest way of demonstrating that right now, and in the shadow of the invasion of capital by Trump's crazed mob, is really in terms of something like the regulation of companies like Facebook and Twitter. And this is becoming a kind of a global problem, right? It's not just about the way in which American policymakers might deal with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. It's becoming a kind of a general problem in terms of the relationship between state and state policymakers and these incredibly powerful, world-defining corporations. Which are entirely unelected, and can say whatever they want. I mean, I think it was it Bezos or somebody? One of them, I've forgotten which one it was. One of the leaders of the big tech companies was attending a parliamentary committee in the UK a couple of years ago, and you could kind of tell the contempt that he had for this stuff. He's a king of the world. Why on earth should he care about what the British Parliament thinks? That's irrelevant. Yeah. That kind of asymmetry is massively dangerous, I think. And it's one that's bizarrely encouraged by the kind of dreams that business schools sell.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
We have a question from Pranusha in the chat.
Pranusha, okay. Isn't it the occupational hazard of academia in general? The universities are self-serving, status quoist organizations across disciplines. I guess, I don't know. I'm not sure about that, Pranusha. I remember part of my background is in, as I said, sociology and anthropology and so on. And for many people in those parts of the social sciences, they would see quite radical potentials in the forms of knowledge that they generate about the social. So say, for example, the ways in which feminist ideas have spread across the social sciences since the 1960s onwards, and becoming really, really central to disciplines like sociology, anthropology, philosophy, and so on. So I don't think that all academic disciplines are necessarily self-serving. Some seem to me to be more conservative with a small c than others. And of course, I'm suggesting that the business school is one of them. One of the criticisms that quite a few people have made of my work is to suggest that I basically want to turn the business schools into sociology departments. And I guess that's probably true. You know, I want business schools to be much more influenced by sociology, anthropology, than they are by economics.
Amit, can I ask a question?
Please, Navdeep, go ahead.
Yeah, Professor Parker, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thanks, Navdeep.
Along with 3 of my colleagues who are here, we had started a course 10 years ago called Investigating Corporate Social Irresponsibility. And
Good.
and yes, absolutely. I mean, the idea was to move away from any, the discursive dominance of CSR to move at what businesses do in their normal business, and then to look at the world through that framing. I mean, we'll take the book in as we go in, your book as we go into the next run of the course. But the question really is that one of the things we tried to do in the course early on was to get students to say that let's make an irresponsibility index. And through that framing, put our recruiters on that, people who come to recruit at the IIM. And there was a lot of resistance from the students in doing that, especially we have a student-run placement committee from doing that. And I think the reason still is that the Chamber of Commerce, with a mix of corporate the consulting companies and big banks and, the likes of Unilever, etc., they literally run the curriculum of the business school. And in doing that, there's this constant conflict and grinding. So, in changing the curriculum, we are actually running up against the interests of our students' employers, recruiters, and that relationship is already sacrosanct in the school. So, I mean, that's one of the resistances that I can see to, transformation in the curriculum. But yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that's a great example, Navdeep. I mean, I think business schools don't like talking about this stuff because they want to present themselves as being intellectually respectable educators who are conducting sort of scientific research and have the best interests of the planet at heart and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, absolutely. For many powerful business schools, the interest of the big corporations that donate or send students, the rest of it, are massively important and effectively shape decision making. The only really high profile school I've ever worked in was the Warwick Business School, which is one of the kind of the bigger ones in the UK. And I got reasonably close to the sort of decision making there. And some of this stuff was just disappointing, let's say, in terms of closing particular courses. There was, for example, a course that I think it was part of the MBA. I think it was a public sector MBA, and obviously public sector salaries aren't as good as private sector salaries. And this course was killed not because it wasn't profitable and had students on it, but largely because it was damaging Warwick's position in league tables by skewing the final salary stuff downwards. So decisions were being made about what were taught on the basis of our position in league tables, which celebrated big salaries as being the most effective measure of education. And that seemed to me to be perverse, positively perverse, and give the lie to the idea that we were interested in the future of the planet or people or diversity or any of those kinds of things. We just appeared to be interested in our position in league tables because that reflected on the amount of cash we might earn next year. So yeah. And I'm sorry to hear that's the case in India.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have Ankur here.
Hey, so I mean, I sort of agree with much of what you're saying, Martin, and I've also followed Navdeep in the stuff that he does. But I mean, I think if I have to sort of problematize some of what we are discussing here,
I thought you were going to. I could hear it in your tone.
That's what we do, right?
Yeah, it's fine.
Partially, unlike other departments, business school, faculty, professors, we live on the reflected glory of our students, much more than other departments. And I mean, the reality of the world today is the glory comes in the salaries and the corporations. And I think, in some ways, we are very much vested into that as well. A lot of the attention that we get is because we are in a business school and we are not in a department of sociology or anthropology. And that attention is coming primarily because of let's face it, the salaries that our students get. So, it's the nexus in some ways is sort of deep, and breaking out of it. I'm with you in terms of the need to break out of it. I'm just struggling in terms of a path.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's beautifully expressed in terms of the reflected glory of our students and their employers and so on. One of the things I'm often quite interested in is thinking about the kind of the history of the institution of the university, because obviously most business schools in the UK are part of universities already. And universities grew by flattering powerful people. The feudal universities of Northwestern Europe, Oxford, Paris, and so on, were essentially teaching the clerics who praised the kings and princes of the day. They're not institutions that have been built on kind of independent critique or something along those lines. And it's not really until the 1960s and the kind of counterculture movements of the 60s that we see this sort of idea, with the growth of subjects like sociology and cultural studies and so on. We see this idea that universities could be places where dissent was expressed. Yeah. Now, it seems to me that the business school could learn a bit from that, in terms of the idea that being dependent on some large sponsors, on donors, on the kind of people that Navdeep was talking about, doesn't mean that they are somehow immune from criticism, or that the kind of system that they represent is immune from criticism. My sense is, and maybe it's different in India, but my sense is in the UK that many deans see their job as a kind of as being a kind of professional flatterer. That their job is to tell corporations how fabulous they are, and to celebrate our successes as if they were the same as the corporations. Now, effectively, that makes us into no more than flunkies, into kind of a training outfit for a big corporation, with no independence of thought, no long-term considerations in terms of the benefits and risks of the kind of knowledge that we're producing, and so on. So it seems to me that breaking the link, however hard that becomes, and it is a difficult thing, I agree with you, that breaking the link between what appear to be the economic interests of the school and our longer term evaluations of what sorts of knowledge should be produced is really, really important. I think one of the curious things I've noticed with quite a lot of my colleagues in more orthodox schools is the way in which they kind of separate what they do at work from what they do outside it. And of course, many of these are very smart people who understand the nature of the climate crisis and problems of inequality, and aren't very positive about Donald Trump and all, a bunch of stuff. But it's almost like at work, they then bracket a lot of that stuff. They just kind of assume it's necessary. We have to be publishing in FT 45 highly ranked journals, and we have to get our business school into some sort of global list of excellence and the rest of it, almost as if there were no choice. And I can see the structural pressures, but I do think that decoupling from them in terms of our longer term interests is really important. There was a question here in the chat from Dibyendu Sharma, who says, what do you think about the recent increasing trend of research on grand challenges, new and SDGs by management scholars? It's interesting that, isn't it? Are you talking a lot about SDGs in India as well? This is becoming a thing. Yeah. It seems to be a global movement now. I was discussing this with somebody yesterday within the city that I live in, Bristol. Lots of the key institutions are now adopting SDG forms of measurement. and claiming that they're addressing different kind of SDGs and so on. I think it's almost providing a kind of language for us to talk about common global challenges, and that might be really helpful. I think having a common language is in itself quite a useful thing. So we can refer to the nature of these 17 different challenges that we face and so on. I guess my problem with the SDGs is that they can also be used as a kind of window dressing as well. That that it's relatively easy for companies to say that we are aiming at something, whatever it might be, but without being quite specific about what particular policies they are engaging in that are meant to address a particular kind of SDG. But broadly, I think if the SDGs provide us global humanity with a way of talking about the stuff that we need to do, that could be quite useful.
Can I ask a question?
Please, George.
Hi, George.
Hi, Martin. Yeah, I also teach along with Navdeep and Akur, so the same courses.
Okay.
Yeah. So based on our experience, and I'm just trying to build on their arguments, that given this large middle class, which is aspirationally shaped for the neoliberal capitalist movement now, and looking therefore the glorified managerial job, right? And those who come to the business school with often their precarious conditions, right? So there are other complicated factors which already Navdeep and Angu mentioned. So it becomes really difficult, therefore, to think about shutting down the business school from that particular perspective. So can you please, if you have any specific actions that you have taken, right, at Bristol, if you could please share with us the experience both from faculty, administrative, as well as from the student side, right? Any specific experience from which we could learn?
Yeah. I don't know if I've got that much to teach you in terms of learning from Bristol, and there are a number of things that a lot of my work at Bristol involves working with the city. Yeah, and I'm interested in the university and in the university School of Management, but only partly. So I don't want to present myself as if I'm central to these kinds of processes, because much of the work I'm doing is outside, is with a whole bunch of activists and organizations doing different things. But one of the things I think I've managed to get through within the School of Management now is the idea that every single module must contain reference to climate change. Yeah, so that there should be no modules that don't have a clear reference, finance, accounting, whatever it is, a clear reference to climate change. And I kind of want to get away from that problem of having, a separate module on CSR, yeah, or a separate module on corporate responsibility for that matter. Yeah, so the idea that we should be embedding this kind of stuff, that it's not optional. All business in future needs to take account of its climate emissions. It's as simple as that. Tagging on to that is an attempt by the current dean to use the SDGs as a way of assessing each of our modules, whether they're contributing to particular SDGs or not. That hasn't got very far yet, and I can see why it might be useful. The climate change one kind of interests me more because I think it's the most urgent one that business schools can address. But I do think it needs to be built into the curriculum in really solid ways. I remember these debates about when I used to be in a sociology department, at that time, the influence of feminist sociologies was becoming very significant. And there were sets of different sort of arguments around, should we have a special module on women's studies or feminism or something like that? Or should we be teaching feminism in all of our modules in a variety of ways so that, half the world's population were represented when we were talking about sociology? And it seemed to me that integrating feminism into the sociology curriculum was the most successful strategy. And so I'd say the same about the business school, I guess, that integrating these things into every single module without exception, and if you don't like it, go and work somewhere else, has to be the strategy, I think. Yeah, and then making a virtue out of that, because one of the things that strikes me, and this was kind of implicit in in one of the earlier comments, I think it was Akur's comment, that what do students want from us? Yeah, what are they expecting from us? And many of the students who I'm teaching, I don't know about you lot, but many of the students I'm teaching are young people who understand fully the realities of climate change. What they don't know is what they can do about it beyond, recycling and buying an electric car. So part of what we should be doing, I think, is using that understanding in order to show them that there are ways of thinking about business, of organization, exchange, which are low carbon, which do provide the possibility of a different a different global business system that isn't so damaging. So giving them a sense of efficacy over this kind of stuff. But I think sometimes we're selling students short. We kind of assume that that they've come to business school to learn how to do capitalism, and then we teach them how to do capitalism, and then we complain when they're just doing capitalism. Yeah. So let's teach them some different stuff. I don't know if that answered the question, George. I sort of walked around the question a few times. Okay.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Hi, Martin, can I ask a question?
Yeah, Pranav.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the nice talk. And I had just one bit of difference with you in capitalism that says that we should grow. But we teach our students, if companies need to die, we should kill them, but in such a manner that we make most money.
Yes,
I teach finance. I was wondering, Martin, the way shareholder voting rights evolved across the world. Initially, it was show of hands, whether you were big or you were small, it kind of counted as one vote. And then slowly from those city councils, how capitalism has evolved, and we don't question it, is the richer you are, the more number of shares you have, the more votes you have. So in capitalism, if you have 1 million shares, you have 1 million votes. While in democracy, whether you're rich or you're poor, or in courts of law, one person is one. There is an inherent conflict between capitalism and democracy. So I thought, could we resolve it rather than not affecting democracy, but maybe changing shareholding rights as it was? So I thought I'll ask your thoughts about it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't know enough about the way that that corporate governance operates in a whole series of different jurisdictions globally to understand the implications of an answer to that question. But I think we can certainly agree that the dominance of corporations now effectively means that they have undue influence over the policies of states and the lives of all of us on the planet. Whether or not that would be addressed by changing voting rights, I don't know. I'm not sure. My instinct has always been that many organizations are just too big, that they need to be cut up into country-sized chunks. Say a company like Amazon, for example, which is effectively, in Europe at any rate, it's a gigantic tax avoidance scheme now, ostensibly headquartered in Luxembourg, but gaining most of its revenues in other countries. Which it doesn't pay tax in. So chopping it up in the way that, say, in the 1920s, the antitrust legislation split up companies, the oil companies in particular, into smaller lumps. But also then, taking that a little bit further and thinking about ways in which not just shareholders, but a whole range of different stakeholders represent the different interests that are reflected in any large company, whether they be the interest of the people who live next door to the factory, or the ecosystems around that might be affected by the factory's emissions, whatever it might be. And we need to kind of build systems in which all of those kind of stakeholders are represented much more effectively, rather than, as your question started off with, just those with a financial interest through a share. There was a question here from Vinay, who says it's a simple question, but it probably isn't. Well, we're talking about changing the ways things are being taught in business schools. Why is it not more important that we make sociology and anthropology schools more grand, more attracting, so the person graduating from those schools occupy a position and have a say in solutions? Yeah, so basically, rather than cutting the business schools down to size, why not Why not celebrate sociology and anthropology in other schools more? Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting idea. I have no idea exactly how we might do that. In the UK, what we've seen, again, I don't know how Indian sociology is faring. In the UK, effectively, sociology, which was a very popular and growing discipline in the 1960s, 1970s. I did my PhD in sociology in the 1980s, and ever since then, sociology has really been declining. It's a subject that's still taught in about a quarter of our universities, but many universities have simply stopped teaching sociology altogether, and it's not, it's not a big and attractive subject. Unlike business and management. Now, in the UK, something like 1 in 7 students are studying business management, finance, accounting. Yeah, so it's gigantically important. And I kind of agree, Vinay, it'd be really nice if lots of these people were choosing to do sociology, anthropology, history of art, whatever, I don't know. But, at the moment, we face a situation where a very substantial chunk of British students, and lots of Indian students coming to the UK as well, are studying business and management. So I think we need to teach them where they are at the moment.
Okay, folks, we probably have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. Martin, how do you want to?
Sure, yeah. If anyone else has questions, we've been going for an hour and 5 minutes, so people might be bored by now. Yeah. Rama looks like he wants to ask a question.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about one of your opening remarks, where you said that part of your disappointment from about business schools comes from the fact that they have the potential to do these things differently than they do. And why do you think that business schools have, given the all pervasiveness of capitalism in everything, and you would expect that business schools are the first things that can be easily captured by the large corporations, right? Why do you think that business schools had the potential to do something differently?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, my sense of this, and this is something quite biographical for me, really, because as I said, I left a sociology department 25 years ago and ended up working in schools of business and management. And there are, and I've been head of department and research dean and various other things like that. I've held many of those positions. One of the big obstacles in the UK, I think, is the way in which the leaders of universities, vice chancellors and presidents of universities, use the business school as their cash machine. Yeah, so the business school has effectively become, in the UK, a way of generating revenue, very often from Indian and Chinese students, for example, which has allowed the government to reduce the central grant to universities. When I went to university in the 1980s, I had a full grant, and the university's costs were all met by central government. Effectively, what's happened in between now and then is that universities have been privatized, and they're now trading in an open market for students. So it's very often it's not necessarily only the deans and the professors who have an interest in these kinds of things. It's quite often the vice chancellors. So I have a sense from my own experience that it would be possible to capture the business school for social justice, for the green movement, for diversity, and so on. Sometimes, if we could keep senior management of the university at bay, yeah, if we could stop them from assuming that they had to treat the business school as if it were a cash machine, and consequently that all its marketing and course development and appointments and so on should be focused on copying the so-called successful business schools. And I've been fighting that fight in the UK for many years now, with no success, really. I'll keep on trying, but I do think the possibilities are there for claiming the business school, and partly because I don't know how this differs in India. In the UK, the fact that most business schools are in universities gives us a real advantage, because we can kind of point towards the idea of the university of being impartial, of seeking knowledge, of being critical, of a certain sort of independence of thought, and say that's what we tell people we do. Not that we just flatter the powerful, or sell people toys to make their lives just to allow them to get a nice car by the time they're 30 or something. Yeah, That's not what we do. So the idea of the university then becomes quite important in that kind of political struggle, I think.
So, Martin, this has led to very stimulating questions, and we are over the time limit. So it's been absolute pleasure having you here virtually at IIM Ahmedabad. Hope to have you sometime over in person once all the pandemic is gone. So thank you very much. I mean, thank you so much. And unless somebody has a question or something, they can hang around or something. But thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you everyone for listening. It's been a real pleasure to be talking to you and to